Some people endure not because they have no other choice, but because they have decided quietly that endurance itself is a form of power, that patience is not weakness, that the person who outlasts the cruelty will be present for the moment the cruelty finally has to account for itself. Afia had eaten in the kitchen for 12 years. Every family meal, every Christmas, every birthday, while the Asante family sat at the dining table, and she sat in the kitchen, alone. And then the patriarch died, and the family lawyer arrived, and opened the will, and the dining room, that room Afia had never once been invited into for a meal in 12 years, went completely silent. This can his royal village tales. Afia came to the Asante household in East Legon, Accra, when she was 28 years old, arriving from Kumasi through a domestic placement agency that had described the family as established, professional, and seeking long-term staff. All three descriptions were accurate. The Asante family had occupied their East Legon compound for over 20 years, a large, well-maintained property that spoke of sustained, managed wealth rather than the flashier new money that had begun appearing in neighboring compounds as Accra's real estate market boomed. Mr. Kwame Asante, 67, had spent his career as a civil engineer who had transitioned in his late 40s into property development, a shift that had multiplied the family's modest professional wealth into something considerably larger, without, to his credit, substantially changing the man himself. He was quiet, deliberate. He moved through rooms the way people do who have thought carefully about what they are doing before they do it. His wife, Mrs. Akosua Asante, 61, was a different kind of presence. Not loud, the Asante household was not, broadly speaking, a loud household, but definitive. She had established, across decades of managing a large family, a specific set of arrangements that governed how the household worked, and she maintained these arrangements with the specific conviction of someone who believes that order is both practically necessary and morally correct, and that any deviation from established order is not simply an inconvenience but a symptom of something more troubling. The dining table arrangement was one of these established orders. Household staff eat in the kitchen, Mrs. Asante had said, on Afia's first day, in the pleasant tone of someone conveying a long-standing policy rather than making a new decision. We find it works better for everyone. It keeps things clear. It kept things clear. What it kept clear, specifically, was the line between the family and the people who served them, a line that, in Mrs. Asante's management of the household, was never explicitly cruel, never the subject of dramatic confrontation, but was maintained consistently as one of the household's fundamental facts. Afia ate in the kitchen, every meal, every Christmas, every birthday, every Sunday lunch when the family's adult children came back to the compound and the dining table, filled with voices and laughter and the specific warmth of a family that genuinely liked each other's company, sounds that traveled, clearly and entirely, through the kitchen door. The Asante family's adult children were three: Kofi, 38, who had followed his father into property development and who ran the family's business operations with a competence that genuinely reflected his own abilities rather than simply his inheritance. Abina, 35, a doctor working at Korlebu Teaching Hospital, who visited less frequently but more warmly when she did. And Yaw, 32, the youngest, who had studied film in the UK and was trying with uneven success to build a career in Ghanaian cinema, a pursuit his mother regarded with the particular mixture of pride and anxiety that parents direct at creative children, whose talent they can see but whose financial stability they cannot. None of the three children had established the kitchen rule. It had existed before they were adults, and it had simply continued, the way household rules continue when they are never examined, absorbed as background, fact rather than active choice. None of them had ever in 12 years invited Afia to eat with the family. Not from deliberate unkindness, this must be said honestly, because the story is more instructive when its cruelty is accurately characterized. They had simply never thought about it. The kitchen arrangement was the kitchen arrangement. Afia was Afia, present, capable, reliable, consistently excellent in her work. But the question of where she ate, or whether the answer to that question might reflect something worth examining, had simply never occurred to any of them. Not even Yaw, who studied stories for a living and prided himself on the specific sensitivity to human experience that creative work requires. Mr. Asante had thought about it. This was not something Afia knew for most of the 12 years. She knew Mr. Asante as a fair employer, consistent. Not warm exactly, but respectful in a way that distinguished him from every other member of the household. He said her name correctly. He thanked her for the food. He asked occasionally whether she needed anything, in the way that made it clear it was a genuine question rather than a formality. But she had not known, until much later, that he had raised the dining room question with his wife not once, but several times across the 12 years, with varying degrees of firmness, and had been met, each time with a response that was entirely Mrs. Asante's in its specific blend of pleasantness and absolute immovability. It creates confusion, Kwame. It blurs things that are better kept clear. She is comfortable in the kitchen. She has never once complained. She wouldn't, he had said once. Exactly, Mrs. Asante had said, as though this confirmed her position. He had not, in the end, overridden her. This was his failure, and he knew it. He had not pushed hard enough, not early enough, and the years had accumulated until the arrangement had solidified, from a temporary policy into a permanent fact of the household, the way temporary things sometimes do, when nobody fights hard enough to change them at the right moment. He did not stop thinking about it, though. In the last 2 years of his life, his health declining slowly, the specific clarifying effect of age and illness narrowing his attention toward what actually mattered, he thought about it with increasing frequency and increasing discomfort. He had a lawyer. Her name was Advocate Mensah, a precise, trustworthy woman he had worked with for 15 years. He called her 18 months before his death and gave her specific instructions about his will. Mr. Kwame Asante died on a Tuesday morning, peacefully in his own house, in the way he had lived quietly, deliberately, without unnecessary drama. The family gathered from across Accra and beyond. Abina came from Korlebu. Ya came from a film set he had been shooting in Kumasi. Kofi was already at the compound, having been present for much of his father's final weeks. Afia cooked. This was perhaps the most honest summary of her experience of that period while the family grieved. She cooked and served, and managed the steady stream of visitors that a man of Mr. Asante's standing attracted in death, and she did all of this with the same quiet competence she had brought to every task in that house for 12 years. She ate in the kitchen throughout the mourning period. Nobody thought to suggest anything different. The will reading was scheduled for 3 weeks after the funeral. Advocate Mensah arrived at the East Legan compound on a Wednesday morning. She was shown into the dining room. Mrs. Asante, Kofi, Abina, and Ya sat around the table. Afia was in the kitchen. And then Advocate Mensah said, before she opened the folder, "Before we begin, Mr. Asante left specific instructions about who should be present for this reading. I need Afia to join us." The dining room was very still. Mrs. Asante's expression, when Advocate Mensah made her request, moved through several configurations before settling on something that was not quite refusal, but was in that direction. "Afia's household staff," she said. "This is a family matter." "Mrs. Asante," Advocate Mensah said, with the specific patience of a woman who had anticipated this response and had no intention of being redirected by it. "These are Mr. Asante's instructions, written and witnessed 18 months ago and reconfirmed in a supplementary letter 6 months before his death. He was explicit that Afia should be present. I would not be honoring his instructions if I proceeded without her." There was a pause. Kofi, practical even in grief, said, "Then let's ask her to come in." Afia was brought from the kitchen, a sentence that carried its own specific weight. Given what it described, a woman being moved from the room she had been confined to for 12 years into the room. She had never been invited to enter for a meal. She sat near the door in the chair that was indicated for her. She did not know what to expect. Mr. Asante had said nothing to her about the will, about any instructions, about anything that might have prepared her for what followed. She had come to the meeting uncertain and quiet, a woman who had learned across 12 years to occupy the minimum necessary space in any room she was in. Advocate Mensah opened the folder. "Mr. Asante was very specific about how he wanted this will read," she began. "He asked me to begin not with the financial provisions, those are straightforward, and will follow but with a letter he wrote. He described this letter as the most important part of what he wanted to leave behind, and he asked that it be read aloud, in full, to everyone present. Before anything else is discussed, she took out several handwritten pages. She began to read. To my family Akosua, Kofi, Abina, and Yaw, and to Afia, who I have asked to be present because this letter concerns her as directly as it concerns any of you. I am writing this in the last period of my life, when the things I have been meaning to address for years can no longer wait for a better moment. I want to speak about a small thing, not a business matter, not an investment or a property or anything that will affect the family's financial position significantly, a small daily thing that I should have addressed years ago and did not, and which I have thought about with growing discomfort for a long time. For 12 years, Afia has eaten her meals in the kitchen, not because she preferred this, not because it was the natural arrangement, because your mother established it as a household rule in Afia's first week, and because I raised it several times across those 12 years, and because I never pushed hard enough to change it, and because a person's failure to push hard enough for what they know to be right is a failure regardless of how quietly it happens. I want to be clear about what this arrangement actually was. Afia has worked in this house for 12 years. She has cooked every meal this family has eaten at that dining table. Christmas dinners, birthday celebrations, Sunday lunches. She has cooked all of them. She has served them. She has cleared them. And she has then returned to the kitchen and eaten. Alone while we sat together and enjoyed the food she made, I tried to tell myself for years that this was simply how household arrangements work, that it was not unusual, that many households functioned this way, that Afia herself had never complained. She wouldn't. This is not evidence that the arrangement was acceptable. It is evidence of the specific dignity Afia has maintained, without recognition, for 12 years, the dignity of someone who does not complain about an unfair situation because complaining has costs they cannot afford to pay. What I should have said 12 years ago and again at every Christmas and birthday since is this: sit down. There is room at the table. You cooked this food. You belong here as much as anyone. I did not say it. I am saying it now from this letter, because a man who waits until he is dead to say something important is not the same as a man who never meant to say it, but he is also not quite the man he wanted to be. To Akosua, I say this without anger. You established the arrangement from what you understood as practical necessity, and I believe you. But I want you to hear from me directly it was wrong, not dramatically wrong, not the kind of wrong that makes history, the quiet, daily kind of wrong that is the hardest to see and the most important to name. To Kofi, Abena, and Yaw, not one of you questioned this in 12 years. I include myself in this. I questioned it privately, which is not the same as doing anything about it. But I want you to understand that the things we accept, without examining, because they have always been a certain way, are often the things most worth examining, especially when the arrangement benefits us and costs someone else. To Afia, you have worked in this house with a quality of character I have never found adequate language to acknowledge properly while I was alive. You did not simply do your work. You did it with a specific dignity and care that made this house what it was, not the building, not the furniture, but the actual daily quality of the life lived inside it. I am grateful for 12 years of that. I should have said so more clearly, more often while I was still in a position to say it with the full force of a living voice rather than from a page. I have made financial arrangements that reflect this gratitude. They are detailed in the will itself. But I wanted the gratitude said in words before it was said in numbers, because numbers are easier to argue with, and I do not want this to be argued with. I'm sorry it took so long. With love, Kwame. Advocate Mensah set the pages down. The dining room was completely still. Mrs. Asante sat with her eyes fixed on a point past the advocate. Her expression the specific stillness of a woman who has just heard something she cannot deflect with pleasantness in front of her own children in her own house. Kofi sat forward, his elbows on the dining table, looking at his hands. Abina's eyes had filled with tears not performed, simply the involuntary response of someone hearing a truth they had known, in some form, without ever articulating it clearly. Hyo, who studied stories and prided himself on sensitivity to human experience, sat with the particular discomfort of someone confronting evidence that sensitivity, claimed but not practiced, is a comfortable lie. Afia sat near the door. She looked at her hands in her lap. The dining room, the room she had heard for 12 years from the other side of a kitchen door, was exactly as she had imagined it. The large table, the heavy chairs, the photographs on the wall, the light through the tall windows that faced the garden. She had not imagined hearing those words in it. She had not imagined the kitchen door meaning what it had just been named as meaning, in a dead man's voice, in his own house in front of his family. She did not cry in the room. She would later. In private, as she had always processed the difficult things quietly, completely without performance. But in the room, she simply sat and received the words. The financial provisions followed. They were, as Mr. Asante had indicated, specific and meaningful, a sum calculated to reflect, as the letter had stated, 12 years of work whose quality had exceeded its acknowledged value, plus a lump sum that would provide Afia with a foundation for a life outside service if she chose it. He had also left her the small guest cottage at the back of the compound. Not the main house, not a grand gesture, but a real one, a home in her own name, freehold, with a separate entrance from the compound that no one could ask her to leave. Mrs. Asante did not contest any of it. This surprised Kofi, who had been half prepared for a conflict that did not come. His mother sat through the remainder of the will reading with an expression he had never seen on her before, not grief exactly, but the specific, private quality of a woman absorbing something she cannot immediately respond to and will need a long time to fully process. She did not speak to Afia directly that day. She spoke to her 3 days later. She came to the kitchen where Afia was working, the same kitchen, the same tasks, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before saying anything. "My husband was right," she said. "I want you to know that I know he was right. I am not going to make a long speech about it, because I don't think a long speech is what's needed. And I don't think I could make one without saying things that would sound like excuses." She paused. "I am sorry." Afia looked at her. "Thank you, madam," she said. It was the same answer she gave to everything quiet. Dignified, 2 words that carried, in their brevity, the full weight of 12 years. Mrs. Asante nodded. She left the kitchen. Afia moved into the cottage at the back of the compound, 2 months after the will reading. She continued working for the family not because she was required to, not because the financial settlement was insufficient to support her independently, but because she had spent 12 years building a specific expertise in the running of this particular household, and because there was, in her own accounting of her situation, a difference between leaving in bitterness and leaving when the time was genuinely right. The time was not immediately right, but something had changed permanently and visibly in the household's daily texture. The dining table arrangement ended, not through dramatic policy announcement, not through formal reversal, but through a simple thing. Abina, on her next visit, set a place for Afia at the dining table for Sunday lunch without asking anyone's permission and without making a speech about it. She simply put down a plate. Nobody said anything. Afia sat. It was the first time in 12 years that she had eaten at that table. The food she had cooked it as she always did tasted, she would note later, to no one in particular, exactly the same as it always had. Of course it did. The food had never been the point. The point had always been the seat. This has been Royal Village Tales. Real power is never loud. It simply endures for 12 years, until the will is read, and the seat at the table is finally named for what it always should have been. Like this video, subscribe to Royal Village Tales, turn on your notifications. The things we accept without examining, because they have always been a certain way, those are the things most worth examining. Royal Village Tales.